All right, so this is an image of Michael Mercel from a video that that was originally recorded on October 15th, 2002, and he is introducing David Antin at the Wexner Center for the Arts on that date, and David is about to read, well, not read at all, clearly, nor has he memorized a part of a text, and that's a kind of interesting Freudian slip on my part to have stated that he was going to read, but he's about to deliver a talk, and that talk is called Varieties of Deception in Meta-Narrative Strategies of Storytelling. And that's fairly complicated and complex, and perhaps we'll break some of that down and discuss the ways that both Michael Mercel in his introduction and David Antin in his what is not a reading, what is in fact a talk piece in the narration of the events of his talk, which is not a reading, employs a variety of terms, including apophasis or parallepsis, and both of these individuals articulate distinctions between very particular specific distinctions between rhetorical terms such as purposeful omission and this definition I think that David coins deceitful omission, and the difference between apophasis and or parallepsis and the opposite of apophasis, right? So that one could imagine that there are, for example, I called attention to the fact that I had misidentified David's talk piece as a reading, when it in fact is not a reading. The only sense in which it's a reading is it's a kind of reading of narrative, right? In other words, when David lists the structural and anthropological scholars of narrative, he's essentially doing a reading of their takes on narrative, as dismissive as that reading might be, and as abridged as that reading might be, and as misrepresentational of those theories as that reading might be. It's nevertheless a reading of those takes on narrative, and in that sense, metaphorically or figuratively, it's a reading. But in terms of the production of the materiality of language, it's clearly a speaking or a talking, if you want to distinguish between speaking and talking. But if my calling attention to the error, was in some way a kind of representation of apophasis, or perhaps not with all of the rhetorical embedding that is required by a philosopher like Aristotle to constitute it as an example of ad hominem deflationary apophasis. It nevertheless works within a kind of semiotic constellation that is related to it, right? Calling attention to it. And it's interesting because I called attention to a slip, an error, and but my calling attention to it also casts some doubt on whether it was in fact, an error, because I did catch it so quickly, right? And if perhaps I wanted it to remain stable in my audience's consciousness, that it was in fact an error and not an intentional misrepresentation, I might have left it uncaught, right? Uncaught the slip and allowed that slip to, like the banana peel on stage, allowed the humor of the falling, to complete itself. And if I were, suffering from some kind of, brain injury or lapse of memory, perhaps allow it to slip into the realm of confabulation as well, and then the character that slipped on such an error would later fail to admit that he ever fell, or that there was a banana peel on stage, or that the slipping was intentional, or perhaps claim to have no such memory of such an event, right? Anyway, all of that perhaps belongs to the semantic or semiotic domain of paralepsis, and then the idea of paralepsis, of course, gives rise, just as the idea of strophe gives rise to antistrophe, right? And the idea of paralepsis gives rise to the idea of its opposite, in this conceptual dialectic sort of way, and which is, the conceptual dialectic is not the same as the structural, configuration of part to whole representations, that David, discusses in it's either, part 2 or 3 of what is not a reading of, what is not a detailed reading of specific structuralist and sociological text regarding narrative, but which is a kind of, metaphorical reading of what those, what those understandings of narrative have in common, and the varieties of expression of those, commonalities, across them. And in that section, I believe it is that he distinguishes between apophasis or paralepsis. I'm failing to remember which term he actually uses, but and that's perhaps perhaps that failure on my part is motivated, interested in some type of discovery that I'm not consciously aware of. Why split the two terms? Perhaps there's something that I desire to make of, or to distinguish between one etymology of the same idea from another. What would distinguish apophasis from paralepsis if we were to investigate such etymologies? I'm tempted to suggest that my failure to remember which term David actually employs in that section, in which he doesn't literally read these theories of narrative, but gives a reading through his speaking and talking of these theories of narrative. I'm tempted to suggest that, in fact, I am suggesting it in the manner of paralepsis, perhaps, though not in, again, the precise circumscription that it's provided as a classical figure, but by allusion, right, and the calling attention to something that may have been omitted or or purposely neglected. Otherwise, calling attention to this interest in distinguishing in the very etymologies of these terms some kind of difference or difference or difference or dissimilarity, a means of a means of splitting as opposed to lumping, and it's maybe that desire to split the difference between apophasis and parallepsis grows out of a concern for the kind of lumping of terms in that second or third section of this talk, which is titled Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Metanarrative Strategies of Storytelling, and the configuration of Prop and Todorov and Rollenbaut and others in this interesting box, or in this interesting camp, or in this interesting sorted category of type X investigation of narrative as an understanding of sequence of events, and perhaps it's that desire because the entire point, as I see it in this particular construct of varieties of deception in narrative strategies of storytelling, is to some ways ironically undermine, right, and detach what could be referred to as surface structure from underlying depth, and the distinction between surface structure and latent meaning as it runs its course through this lecture, which is not a reading but a speaking or a talking. It seems to me, very much depends upon the knowledge, right, that the audience has of the speaking subject's identity, in the same way that in Greek myth, right, the action on stage doesn't occur in this kind of representational vacuum in which a character is presented and what the audience learns over the course of the drama or the theatrical representation is the story of this character. The audience already knows the story because it's part of the, not just mythos, but mythology, the interlocking system of the mythoi that make a logos, for the culture, and in a certain sense, part of at least which the culture is founded upon, right? The links of these between these stories and the identity of the culture with the interpretation of the stories, not an identity with the stories as object, but with an identity with the narratology of and hermeneutics of the manipulation of these stories in various contexts to reveal various social meanings, and so the events of a comedy, the events of a tragedy, the performance would be one such socio-political loci in which the performance and the entailments of interpretation and the entailments of a kind of collective hermeneutics would perform itself out, and would and of course, would depend upon who was, present for that event. In other words, social meanings would emerge out of the nature of the audience and the relationships and power relationships and relationships of social intercourse that the members of the audience were participating with, and that would be understood. And I think that would also be the case for Elizabethan theater and a variety of theaters. Perhaps before the mass marketing of the theater that we might refer to as Hollywood, in which the notion of a public couldn't be addressed in terms of necessarily in terms of individual communicative acts. That is, that the idea of an audience or a public at that point, under the terms, that Walter Benjamin, argues in his beautiful essay, "The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction," attained an abstract level, right, in which no longer were individuals communicating with one another, but an industry was communicating with an abstracted idea of who belonged to this particular domain of the mass audience or public, and it was certainly still possible to identify mythological figures in that public or that audience, but those figures themselves would have more in common with the heroes and gods and monsters represented in the mythologos than they would with actual individuals, in an actual auditory or amphitheater, physical, space-time, and belonging to this very human domain of social and cultural interaction, right? And even though such a figure might exist in the audience, the representation of such a figure within the domain of the Hollywood representation would take on the characteristics of the mythologos, and therefore participate, right, in the what we could call archetypalizing of the figuration of self and identity. But before that, that probably wasn't entirely the case, and the idea of there being discrete, and familiar, faces, either masked or unmasked in the audience, was an important part of the relationship between the performance of this particular story that was, perhaps, if not familiar to all, familiar to most of the citizens of the mythologo, how would you say, mythologo poesis of the culture, mythologo poesis of the cultural imaginary. That's what one would say, perhaps. And that term isn't used in this particular speaking and narrating. That's referred to as I said, varieties of deception in the varieties of deception in the rhetorical strategies of narrative storytelling, and for whatever reason now I'm having a hard time remembering the title of the narrative, but perhaps all of those reasons, the splitting versus the lumping, and all that is why I'm having so much trouble remembering why I'm having so much trouble remembering whether not why, whether it's the term apophasis or prolepsis that is used in a part of this particular discussion to distinguish it from. Have we even talked about what the opposite of apophasis or prolepsis might be? If prolepsis is this rhetorical device calling attention to something, in order to calling attention to it by rhetorically referring to an omission of attention to it, right? So that I will not call it. Say that it's say that the horror. Say that we have to face the horror of the possibility of Donald Trump receiving the Republican nomination for candidacy for president in 2024, and he faces Joe Biden once again, and imagine that possibility occurs, and imagine that Trump actually engages Biden in debate, which is probably unlikely because he's aware that he's not very intelligent, and he'll look bad, right? But maybe not. Maybe there's a kind of self-deception in which he can imagine that as the hero of his own story, is kind of Alazon figure, kind of fascist Alazon figure that he's blind to his own faults and failures and madness and lack of ability to reason and participate in moral argument and inability to empathize with others. Anyway, there's certainly a long list of things that he would have to be blind to in relationship to himself. As one of the constructions of Oedipus, makes Oedipus ignorant of certain, if not self-interests and desires. Objective facts, right, in the world in which he's located, and we'll argue against that reading of Oedipus here later, but that's one construct. But imagine that Trump is on stage and willing to debate Biden because for whatever reason he's like this image of Michael Mercel, he's surrounded by darkness, right? So perhaps in a kind of cave of failure of self-understanding and self-comprehension, and so he's willing to have this debate, and then one can imagine. Perhaps there's a moment in the debate in which in which Joe Biden, says something like, I'm not going to call attention to any one of the more than 55 examples of criminal offense that Donald Trump, or perhaps he'll say Mr. Donald Trump, performed and engaged in, while he was president. That would be an example of whether we wanted to call it apophasis or parallepsis. Clearly well-defined example of the use of that figure. And but the examples here will be less clearly defined, and they will participate in various ways with this ambiguous figuration that crosses back and forth between apophasis and whatever its opposite might be. And one of the the best examples of the opposite of parallepsis, at least that I see in this particular revealing, in this particular example of what is not a reading of the structure of narrative, but is a speaking about and talking about the structures and forms of varieties of deception in rhetorical strategies of narrative storytelling. David spends some time talking about the fact that one of the things that was well known in Greek culture was that Oedipus's father, Laius, not only knows of the prophecy regarding which his son is destined to kill him and usurp his place as king and ruler of Thebes, but so he not only knows this prophecy, right, and is aware of it, but becomes aware that as an adult that Oedipus has become aware of this prophecy, and becomes aware that the act through which he attempted to avert this prophecy by killing the infant son had actually failed, and becomes aware of both the survival of his son, now somewhat lame, but still not so lame as to be incapable of traveling the road to Thebes, becomes aware of his survival and becomes aware of his surviving son's attempt to subvert or outwit the conditions of his own destiny by leaving the place in which he was raised and taking to the road, and in order to subvert the prophecy and destiny and fate that was revealed, to him, Laius. He also takes to the road and intends on meeting Oedipus at this place, this sort of crossroads of fate and destiny, and to destroy him there. it in no way is Laius, right, and in his chariot with his drivers on the road, accidentally, and in no way is the meeting between Laius the father and Oedipus the son accidental. And this, of course, to any Greek, familiar with the deep structure of this particular myth, this would have been obvious. And so in Sophocles, retelling where the reason, the rationale, for Laius' presence on the road, upon which he meets Oedipus, is a kind of deceitful omission, right? Not an omission of confabulation or a merely purposeful omission, but as a kind of deceitful omission. And this kind of deceptive omission is what is being defined in this lecture that David provides, titled "Varieties of Deception in Strategic Narrative Storytellings," as being the opposite of paralepsis, or the opposite of apophasis, and being the opposite of apophasis or paralepsis is not the same as being a structural binary, right? That defines the articulation of form or structure, or the, one could say, syntax or grammaticality of narrative, right? As a kind of what would one say, like rule order, like formality, right? That things take this form, and this form can be defined by this rule, or the logic of this order, this organization, this particular linearity, or this particular transformation, or this particular sequence of transformations within these boundaries that limit those transformations to certain types of forms, right? It can't be defined that way. It has to be defined more like the way that the Greek stage is defined, by movements this way and that, left and right, strophe and antistrophe, strophe, antistrophe, almost a call and response, as a kind of dialect, or dialogical movement, one could say, dialectic, and that movement between these figures of deception, right, is necessary in defining the space of what is constituted as metanarrativity, and because the difference between deception and the perception of deception is so important in the movement and play back and forth as strophe antistrophe in this figuration, and in fact that metanarrativity can't exist without this movement back and forth. In fact, implicitly, what David seems to be arguing is that self, can't exist without this movement back and forth between the play of bearing truth and bearing witness and deception, right? So that one could say that there's a movement back and forth that perhaps belongs to this idea of also this play between confabulation and what we might call the Pinocchio problem, and we'll discuss that perhaps further as well, as we proceed further through the narratives, and that's a good place to begin with a description of Michael Mersel's introduction to this long what is not a reading, because Mersel, after he identifies what he refers to as familiar faces in the audience, and defines that familiarity in terms of features that resemble a grand piano, then, in other words, the figures that are familiar in the audience, first he identifies, and again, like, the importance of that is powerfully significant, right? The importance of familiarity, because if we imagine that the movement of narrative is a play that moves back and forth between the calling attention to acts of deception and self-deception, right? Like the audience in ancient Greece, depending upon whether we know, that Laius, is not there on the road, accidentally or not, our readings or our listenings or our comprehensions and our understandings of the story are going to vary depending on what state of anagnoresis, or what state of ignorance, or what state of not knowing we belong to. And as an audience, that relates to this idea of familiarity, right? Familiarity with the story, with the characters in the story. And in tellings of biography or autobiography, as David performs, our understanding and familiarity with his own story, right, will determine what our relationship to the narrative, as either familiar or unfamiliar, is. And if we approach it, from this point of view of the stranger coming into the telling without knowing David at all, right, will be very much unlike the Greek that knows the story of Oedipus and Laius, and knows the deep background of the story, knows that Laius had been informed later that Oedipus had escaped his the initial attempt to alter the destiny made on the part of Jocasta and her husband, and that the mercy of that shepherd resulted in the growth of Oedipus to manhood. And if we know that, and from that cultural perspective, and we know that Laius adventured out that day with his retinue, for the purpose of destroying his son, the purpose once again that had initially failed when the son was born, and he was condemned to death. Then the understanding of that meeting will have a very different significance than if we're unaware, right, of those details, and why the poet Sophocles hides that, or in some sense purposefully omits it, right, deceptively omits it from the story, will have a meaning to us that otherwise isn't there, and that determines our identities in some sense as audience members, right? A relationship to that background knowledge and to the details of the story as they relate to these figures whose stories precede them, just as David Antin's story precedes him, and our familiarity or unfamiliarity with that story will determine our relationship to the talk piece. And that's what Varieties of Deception the strategic rhetorical narration of storytelling is all about. And Michael Mersel, opens with this comparison of the familiar faces, right? Playing off of that idea of how familiar is the audience with all of this material. The familiar faces in the audience. So some faces will be familiar, and presumably some of those familiar faces will know more about the background of David Antin's own story. And Mersel's introduction itself can be said to be sort of metapoetic in the way that it reaches out to this idea of what we can refer to as autobiographical memory, and his discussion of that, but also to the way that he identifies the individuals in the audience by calling attention to why these faces are familiar, and to comparing, right, audience members' faces to the familiar features of a grand piano. So with that, I can more or less begin, and what I'll do is I'll narrate over each section and describe what the figure on stage is discussing and narrating as we go along. So we'll begin with and I'll mute the actual discussions and merely narrate that. All right, so this is the beginning of Michael Mersel's introduction to David Antin, and this piece that David Antin is going to perform, via speaking or talking, that is referred to as Varieties of Deception in the strategic narratology of storytelling, and here he's acknowledging the familiar faces and the audience, and appreciating the familiar faces for being there, and then defining that familiarity as through the comparison of faces with the familiar features of the grand piano. So he recognizes this one's face as more rich and varying in sonority than an ordinary face, and then this one's face as having a wide dynamics from pianissimo to fortissimo, and that one's face, he claims is has a more substantial tone than your ordinary, abstract face, and this other one's face has a higher ability to add subtle expression to notes, and in this one's face, sound appears to be uniform and well balanced, and that face over there has an ability to note repetitions, and in this one's face, the mouth is bulging with what appears to be 88 white, wood or ivory covered teeth, and this one's face appears to have a retractable cover, and upon this one's face is a presentation of sheet music, and this one's face doesn't have a spring that needs to be reset, he claims, and And this one over here has a face that looks like it might, come from Astoria, Queens, and just like that story, since we've been, talking about Oedipus, just like that story of Oedipus, and there's a moment, and after that decisive moment in which Oedipus kills Laius, that Oedipus is greeted on the road to Thebes, at least in some versions of the stories, by this female, chimera figure called the Sphinx. Let's just go back. He got through that a lot faster than I did. He's very concise in the way that he speaks, so he can. I need to return to the beginning so that I can fit it all in. I'm not as concise a speaker or reader as some. Just like the figure in the Sphinx is riddle, right? That at one moment in the course of this figure's life is said to have 3 legs. Some of the individuals, well, not some, one specific individual in the audience, the familiarity of the face is identifiable comparatively by the fact that it appears to have 3 legs, and comparatively with a grand piano, that is, and that's the first part of the introduction that Michael Mersel provides for David Antin, and then the second part, and I believe he's engaging that here, is a discussion of the basis of autobiographical memory, and the way that the basis for that specific type of memory either emerges from or contains at least an idea of self and selfhood, and what self might be, and autobiographical knowledge and memory in under these terms could say is what the self utilizes to discuss or grant access to information about itself, to itself, and those exist, and that apparatus exists whether the autobiographical memory, right, is subject to conditions of confabulation, or whether it's entirely accurate. And one could say, whatever, even if one doesn't, believe in objectivity, honest or truthful. And in that sense, autobiographical memory would appear to exist outside the domain of varieties of deceptive rhetorics, right, utilized to organize metapoetic strategies of narrational discourse. And yet, Michael Mersel claims, he's claiming right here, as we're narrating over him, that in fact this oscillation between what the self believes, and again, we're going to have to return to the beginning, because once again, he's much faster at getting all of this out than I am at recounting it. But in order for the self to talk about itself, even under its own delusions of honesty, it has to move back and forth, strophe and a strophe, between these conditions of truth-telling and self-deception, and the reason for that is because the self wants to protect itself from these aspects of autobiographical memory in which the shadow threatens to emerge and reveal it as what it as what it refuses to see itself as. It doesn't want to see itself as the deceiver, and is necessary to deceive itself into the belief that it is the truth teller. And so what he refers to as the deception within, right? The deception within the logos of the autobiographical knowledge center of the self lies like this hidden Pinocchio figure, right? That is always trying to catch up with its let's see how to put it, to hide itself, right? But the more that it hides itself, the more that it's exposed. So the first part of the talk, and I'm not sure whether that's being revealed here or later, or earlier rather, but the first part of the talk, begins with this idea of what autobiographical knowledge might be under the conditions of memory, and how it's organized, and that largely traces out of parallelism to these structural principles of narrative, right? Lifetime into periods, general events, and then specific knowledge, which might be like the content that belongs to any structural formulation of narrative. Like, for example, Prop, when he introduces in folktales what themes might be that cross the conditions of these narratives, right? Okay, so lifetime principles that are constructed out of general knowledge, right? And they're distinguishable, right? And perhaps belong to like thematic periods and time frames, as in theories of childhood development, right? So for example, in Bildung's roman or whatever, there's a period spent at school, and then there's a period in which one enters the workforce, and then if one's an outlier, perhaps those conditions. I have to return to the beginning again because he's very quick at getting all of this in, and I'm not. I mean, that's why I'm not an academic, because I'm too slow, and I can't get this information out as quickly and as concisely as these snappy people can. But so anyway, these life periods define and are part of the constitution of the syntax and vocabulary of this autobiographical knowledge, and the way that the self communicates this story to itself, and as such, it's already culturally and socially politically constructed, right? Because these periods belong to larger domains than the narrative frameworks of random events, right? As they are constituted on a day-to-day or minute-to-minute or hour-to-hour, or however you wanted to divide up time. And they can be distributed. You can reorganize them, and redistribute them as you see fit, right, in the telling of your story. But they necessarily demand, an engagement and an organization that, in one way or another, either falls into these periodic thematic categories, or that are challenged by the narrating subject, right? So he talks about general events that cluster into common themes. So there's an aspect of lumping there, and he talks about the causality, right? Like the kind of Madeline effect, in which one memory might be a cue to recall another, and that those instantiations of narrative causality, right, function for the self as a way of lineating, but also delineating the temporal, right, movement across domains of time. And then if one begins a vector with instantiating event X, and moves to the resulting event Y, and then from that resulting event Z, that particular cluster can be reorganized into another duration of instantiating temporal cause, right? That can promote a larger narrative movement, right? All right, and then he talks about clusters of events that fall under categories such as first-time achievements, or monumental moments, or marked by significances, and how those relate to Dewey's idea of John Dewey's idea of having an experience, and how instances that are marked from other instances by significance or importance relate to those notions of. Gotta go back again because I just don't know how he gets it all in. But instances of event and significant knowledge that have a greater import in defining the constitution of self than say the arbitrary cluster events that don't stand out, right, and become this background out of which what we call environment is constituted. Now that background of unspecified or insignificant event phenomenon is the essential ground, upon which we see the figure of the self emerge. In other words, say like there was no background here, like this curtain, this black curtain that we see, behind Michael Mercel narrating. Say that was all just more Michael Mercel's. Well, it would be very difficult to identify him as a figure in the foreground of this background of Marcel Mercel's than it is if it's this indistinguishable, right, and this indistinguishable sort of unspecified, and so the figure of the self emerges. Okay, going back again, because again you got all that in, and we're only on the second section, and there's another section, but all of that emerges, right? All of that self emerges because Michael Mercel is distinguishable from this vague and undefined and indeterminate curtain, right, in the background. So he moves on and he discusses event-specific knowledge, detailed information, right, about individual events, and this you could say in storytelling belongs to the realm of the descriptive, right? So if David were going to talk about some event in his life, say he was expressing one of these varieties of deception, in order to push this fabrication of events, right? And we won't call lying, but we'll call a creative storytelling, myth making, right? If he wanted to push that an element of that story into the believable, the domain of the believable, there will be there'd be gestalts, right, of believability or of truth telling that can be marked, right, by details, right? So there's a song about that, and it's funny and it's amusing. But do you remember there's a song about this couple and when they met, and what the details of this initial meeting were, and of course the singers, right, the two subjects who sing this song have very different memories of the details of this meeting, and it calls into question, particularly on the part of the male singing subject, whether he actually remembers this meeting at all. And that, of course, is interesting in relationship to the compatibility of the two, and what memory means, right, to romance. All right, so one of the markers of believability and that plays into the Pinocchio problem is that event-specific knowledge, the more detailed the information, the more likely it is that it'll be presented, it'll be perceived as true or believable. And go back to the beginning again, because I'm still not getting through this. If one is fabricating, then in order, for the fabrication, for the myth, to seem true, one has to add detail. And of course, the more detail one adds, one could say the more that one is, lying, or the more Pinocchio problem one has, placed in the narrative, right? So, for example, if David Antin were narrating, a fabricated romance that he had in his youth, he would specify perhaps, the color of the woman's, hair and her, complexion and the graceful or lack of or the opposite, or the lack of grace, with which, she performed, the duties of her job, and perhaps the way that she held, her mouth, or, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what's interesting is that in actual memory, high levels of detail in event-specific knowledge actually fade very quickly, right? But if so, those types of details, unless they have been, operationally, meta self-narrated, of a number of times, and perhaps in various ways, are less likely to be held in memory than the broad, abstracted, and one could say sorted and socioculturally organized, right? One could say provisionized, right? The provisional, right? These are the domains that are provided by a cultural inscription that are going to be held in consciousness for a longer duration than ESK, event-specific knowledge, because those details don't belong to abstract categories that are so repeated, culturally repeated, that one reenacts them, again and again and again, unless they belong to that aspect of the self that narrates back to itself, or repeats again and again and again, for whatever reason, whether that is an obsession, and that obsession could belong to the erotic domain, or something that the subjectivity is trying to define as a possible future. One could say, like Freud's idea of daydream, belongs to this field of the pleasure principle, and the repetitions that belong to it, or as this one could say, like principle of flight, right? Like the fantasy of flight, like that one repeats again and again and again to as perhaps existed in Oedipus's mind, this fantasy of fleeing his destiny, this destiny that was so horrible to him that he couldn't imagine acting it out. So he's continuously fleeing self-knowledge, right? And in those instances, for whatever motivates the repetition of the repetition, then event-specific knowledge could enter into, and enter back into the equation. And then, what makes that interesting from a psychological point of view is, well, why that detail? Like, why red hair? Why whatever? And or why that specific detail? And that, of course, is where the whether it's an example of a confabulation or event-specific repetition, or that is based on some other aspect of psychological obsession, or whether or in whatever way that the subject narrating is either conscious or unconscious of the motivation for the detail. It's the detail itself that holds the clue of narrative in that deeper sense, right? The deeper sense, like, well, why deceive oneself? There you go. Let me go back to that, because that was a nice gestural movement. Okay, so I want to get that coordinated here. Why deceive yourself with that detail? Let's see if I can do it again. It's like I might have missed it. Why deceive? No, he's not going to do it. Okay, so I'm having trouble syncing this, but imagine that, maybe I go back a little further, see if I can find it. Over there's that detail. Yeah, there you go. Why deceive yourself with that detail? Okay, so why that particular? So it's not even in the detail. The detail has less to do with the actual reality or the construct of the events in memory as an objective emphasis, as they do. Well, why deceive yourself with that detail, or why underscore that detail? Why did you remember that detail? So the idea is that there's something that belongs to either a need or a disavowal or a repetitive obsession within somehow within the detail itself, and that is essentially a kind of like Freudian dream work reading, right? And he goes on and he talks about memory decay, and he talks about episodic memory and hierarchical structure within autobiographical knowledge, and more. Again, he returns to memory restored in lifetime of periods and how themes, right, constitute periods and durations in memory. And then he introduces this idea of the autonoetic consciousness, recollection of experience in the sense of a mental time travel. And of course that interests us very much because we're mental time travelers in a way very similar to William Blake. And the way that in mental time travel recollections consist and exist within a sense of self in the past and some imaginary and sense perceptual details, but that reflect, right, the integration of all of these parts into autobiographical knowledge and the foundation of a working self, right? So one can, in a sense, become the waking dreamer, right, of memory, and it's that moment in Proust in which that he begins, not experiencing the mental time travel of the Madeleine, but that he begins narrating the experience of the mental time travel initiated or instantiated by what seemed to be, right, the arbitrary phenomenon of the experience of the Madeleine. But what does it mean for an event to be arbitrary if it initiates, right, an example of autonoetic consciousness? And that is one of the most interesting moments of of Michael Mersel's introduction, because then, in that sense, autonoetic consciousness is the self-performance of the working self, right? And go back to the beginning again. And involves, and that's the argument, and then necessarily involves, right, talking about these distinctions between voluntary and involuntary, as the mental time travel appears to be involuntary, but becoming aware of the involuntary nature of the mental time travel involved in the Madeleine, one can choose to be on that road to Thebes or not on that road to Thebes, and tell that part of the story. For example, I can, having become aware of the transportation, right, granted by that particular taste of that particular Madeleine, I can choose to have that particular mental time travel experience by choosing that particular item if I go to that particular cafe or another type of cafe. And I can experiment with other types of pastries or non-pastries or coffees or teas, and I can combine, right, those coffees and teas and pastries in different ways, and experience different relationships to the parts of mental time travel, and I can organize, the workings of each of the dimensions of those component autonoeic consciousnesses and meta autonoeic consciousnesses of the mental time travel involved with those selections, right? By playing them out, experimentally in different settings, and in that sense, working self, is more than just a set of what one would say active personal goals, or self-images organized into goal hierarchies, because it's the play back and forth between the arbitrary and the determinate, or the meaningful and the accidental, between the fate and the knowledge, right, of escape or assimilation to the image of fate, that constitute, a more fully engaged, we say, metanoetic, but also metapoetic consciousness of the working self as encompassing episodic memory, but also exceeding it, and exceeding it exceeding in a sense the parameters of what constitute biographical knowledge, by being able, like, to think of knowledge of the knowledge of autobiography as belonging to a higher domain and a higher expression of actuality within the acting of that individual consciousness toward or away from, say, a set that is merely either manipulable, right? I can move this part from here to there, or merely logic gate, through which one passes through the logic gate of Madeleine to this experiential domain, right? Okay, and that's the second part of what Michael Mersel does in his introduction to David Antin's narrative. We're getting pretty close to an hour here, or we may have exceeded it, and I'm going to leave. I'm going to leave the third part of his introduction and what he refers to as the Pinocchio problem in abeyance, and I'm going to at this point, I'll probably publish this separately as a series of 17 inquiries, or a 17-part inquiry, or a 17-part investigation of, or a 17-part, interpretation or paraphrase, perhaps, of this piece titled Varieties of Deception in Narratological Strategies of Storytelling.